Good morning. This is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe. I'm Jumana Bersachi in Dubai, and these are the stories that set your agenda. Falling short. AI giant Nvidia tumbles as its revenue forecast misses some of the most optimistic estimates.
We're going to have lots and lots of supply, and we will be able to ramp starting in Q4. We have billions of dollars of revenues, and we'll ramp from there into Q1, into Q2, and through next year. We're going to have a great next year as well.
Breaking barriers. Jake Sullivan sits down for rare talks with the top Chinese general as both nations aim to improve military dialogue. And the latest read on inflation. Spain and Germany CPI data out later this morning. We'll let you know what to expect. Well, the big focus for the investment community, of course, were on those Nvidia earnings that came through late last night. And let us get you an evaluation of how markets have reacted, because even though Nvidia's revenue, top-line revenue, pretty much doubled year on year, investors were perhaps a little bit disheartened by some of the guidance that came through. We're going to talk more about the specifics of what came through from that earnings call. But what you need to know is that Nvidia stock traded as low as 8% lower in after hours. It is having an impact on the Nasdaq 100. As you can see, the futures there seen opening lower to the tune of 0.6%, building on from yesterday's losses. They closed down 1% as well. So there was a lot of nervousness into this earnings report. S&P futures also leaning negative as well. Euro stocks following on from that negative momentum too from Asia, also seen opening about 0.2% weaker. The only exception is the FTSE 100. The UK index is seen opening up in positive territory. But switching over and taking a look at cross-asset as well, not a lot of movement. As far as rates are concerned, you can see the U.S. 10-year yield hasn't really done much overnight. We moved about 1 basis point higher, 3.83. Up ahead, though, we have jobless claims to watch out for today. Always important when you think of the context of the U.S. labor market. So the signals there will be closely analyzed by the investment community and as to what they could mean for next week's non-farm payrolls report as well. Brent, you can see slightly higher on the session, up about 0.2%. But as you've been talking about, it's been quite difficult for energy and the energy complex to sustain a bid. The fact that we're trading below $80 on a week of such high geopolitical risk and oil disruptions tells you a lot about how weak the demand outlook actually is. And then finally, the euro, you can see trading sideways-ish today at around 111, about 0.2% firmer, heading into those all-important inflation figures. We have numbers coming out of Spain in a short while and Germany as some of the state figures, in addition to the actual countrywide figure coming out later on today too. So it will be a big driver for the euro. But let's also check in on how Asian markets are faring with Avril Hong in the Singapore studio. Avril, just give us an overview.
Yeah, Jumana, as we've been discussing for much of today, Asia's chip stocks are down, particularly Nvidia's direct suppliers. That's where you're seeing slightly steeper declines, especially on SK Hynix. TSMC also a direct supplier of Nvidia. But as some of our Bloomberg intelligence colleagues have been highlighting, maybe it's not all doom and gloom. For the likes of TSMC, for example, maybe it's going to start leaning more on some of its smartphone chip production for the likes of Apple, for Qualcomm. And then for Hon Hai, that clarification that came through from Nvidia on ramping up the Blackwell production in the fourth quarter of this year might help to ease some of the concerns about the AI server supply chain. But still, this is a negative picture we're seeing on chip stocks flip the board. Unsurprisingly, that's dragging those tech-rich indices in the region, the Kospi, the TAIEX. These are the ones that are underperforming. But even as you see these declines, and indeed on the infotech sector, note as well that we're seeing some gains in the utilities and healthcare-related stocks in the region, so maybe it's part of rotation. The other thing I would highlight is even though the Hang Seng is down, we're seeing a bright spot in the form of Meituan. Remember how earlier in the week, Pinduoduo as well as Nongfu really raised these concerns about the consumer malaise in China, but Meituan as a bright spot showed how its core food delivery business is buoyant. That sales beat is helping the stock jump 10%, helping to cap the declines on the Hang Seng. Flip the board, I want to talk you through what we're seeing in Japan more specifically, because today we did get a 2-year JGB auction, really strong demand, 5 times bid to cover ratio, best since 2019, and it seems like it gives an indication of how bond traders see a delay in the potential rate hike from the BOJ, at least for this year. But don't forget, tomorrow we also have a Tokyo CPI print that could put a rate hike on the table. In terms of the Japanese currency, we're seeing it headed for a second straight month of gains. Jumana.
Thank you for the comprehensive overview and, of course, keeping a close eye on some of the ramifications of those Nvidia earnings on to those Asian chip makers. But let's talk more about Nvidia in detail. It fell post-market after it delivered an underwhelming forecast and news of production snags with its much-anticipated Blackwell chips. The outlook threatens to cool an AI frenzy that has powered global tech stocks this year. Speaking exclusively to us, the chief executive, Jensen Huang, reassured investors by saying the firm is ramping up production.
We're expecting Q3 to have more supply than Q2. We're expecting Q4 to have more supply than Q3. And we're expecting Q1 to have more supply than Q4. And so I think our supply condition going into next year will be a large improvement over this last year.
Let's get out to our tech reporter, Annabelle Jewelers, who joins us now. Annabelle, I look at these figures and I see $30 billion revenue for the quarter, up more than 120% year on year. And yet that still wasn't enough to satisfy what investors were looking for. Was it just a case of the bar set way too high going into these earnings?
Yeah, there's certainly a lot of expectations that are already built into the stock price. And as you say, yeah, the bar is so high and even Nvidia couldn't exceed it. But talking about the numbers we had, because it was another great quarter, we saw the beat for the second quarter and then also the revenue projections going into the third quarter. So the company said they'd make about $32.5 billion in revenue. Analysts have been predicting $31.9 billion. So again, that's a beat there. The estimates, though, had ranged up to nearly $38 billion at the top end of the range. And so that is the concern there. Yes, you beat a lot of different projections on Wall Street. You just didn't beat everyone's projections on Wall Street, and it seems like you've got to do that with quite a wide gap. So heading into the announcement, of course, there was a lot of concerns around Nvidia's Blackwell chip lineup. This is sort of the next generation of AI chips that could really be the next big cash cow for the company. Concerns around production delays, perhaps. They are saying that they have improved the manufacturing yield and they're going to start to really ramp up production in the fourth quarter. That's what Nvidia is saying, at least.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting that the CEO mentioned billions, but didn't actually pin down a number on the supply of Blackwell. But what else did we hear on the demand side?
That's also one of the key concerns, of course, because Nvidia makes up a lot of its revenue from these so-called hyperscalers. They're companies like Alphabet, Apple, Meta even, that are investing billions of dollars into cloud computing and cloud infrastructure that's needed for the AI revolution. There's a concern, though, that perhaps there's a little bit of overspend coming through, and so that could lead to a bubble. There's also concern that Nvidia is becoming too reliant on these companies. But we did actually speak to Jensen Huang about that, and he says we're really just in the first innings of this. You're going to see more companies, more industries, more governments all looking to purchase Nvidia chips. But speaking about Nvidia and this Blackwell chip design as well, because as you said, we didn't get that full figure of what we can expect from the fourth quarter. But I did think it was particularly interesting what our Bloomberg intelligence team, Robert Lee, said in the last hour, talking about that sort of cake analogy. You can make one cake really well, you can make one Blackwell chip really well. Doesn't mean you can really reproduce that kind of thing en masse. Could we see any sort of production delays? It is a very highly complex chip, and it's a very big task ahead for Nvidia as well. So yes, they've got that sort of assurance for the rest of the year. We'll see how it extends into 2025.
So room for some skepticism, at least as far as the market is concerned this morning. Bloomberg tech reporter Annabelle Jewelers, thank you so much. Well, with Nvidia earnings failing to impress investors, stocks in Asia have slipped as well, as we were just talking about with Averill, while Chinese results helped extend the sell-off in the country's tech companies. So let's get more analysis from Bloomberg's Mark Cranfield. Averill was just describing to us the sort of negative risk-off session that has transpired with some of these Asian stocks. Is that valid to your mind?
Well, actually, when European investors get to work today, they actually might be a bit surprised that Asia isn't doing even worse than it looked, because with Nvidia losing about 7% or so in aftermarket trading, you would have expected probably an even bigger reaction. We did initially. Nasdaq futures, when they first opened, they looked pretty bleak. They were down to about 1.4% underwater, but they've recovered gradually. Now, some of that could well be a month-end effect. We're coming towards the last 2 trading days of the month, and it's a long weekend in the United States. So trading will end earlier than usual tomorrow. So there's less time for people in the States to actually cover their positions if they need to. So that's probably giving it a little bit of a boost as well. So overall, the impact has been a little bit less than you may expect. That may be delayed until next week, because traditionally over the long Labor Day weekend, it's a time when people reassess their outlook for the final few months of the year. And if you think that people are concerned that the Fed is a bit behind the curve, economy is starting to slow down, we've got a massive jobs report next week, people could come into next week looking a bit defensive. And that will probably take the edge off equities as well. So although markets are holding up reasonably well today, that may not be the case as we go into next week.
Yeah. Mark, another perhaps more China-specific question for you. Chinese stocks are heading for another monthly loss. And we've been talking a lot about the weakness that's coming through on the macro data. But then also at a company level earlier this week, Temu owner disappointing with the guidance, that massive drop in PDD. Today, Avro was talking about some surprisingly good color coming through from Meituan. Just piece it all together for us. So what exactly is going on the ground?
I think that probably tells you exactly how bad sentiment is towards Chinese equities. When you have a big company like Meituan can produce good results, the stock was up about 10% at one stage today, and yet the overall market is still down. We've also had some bank earnings this week, which are not so great. That's put a bit of a cloud over the market. And banks make up a very large constituent of the Chinese market, and they're very closely tied to the Chinese government as well. So that's a pure negative for the market. We've seen a lot of downgrades on the economy. Even Bloomberg Economics themselves have put out a big story saying that the Chinese economy may never be the largest economy in the world. For so many years, the story was, when would China overtake the United States? It's looking less and less likely because of the slowdown in China. So that, plus private analysts also downgrading their forecast for this year and next year. So overall, the picture is not a pretty one for China. And even when you get one good stock, it's not helping the overall market.
Yeah, and talking about those private analysts, UBS, I saw cut its forecast for China's GDP growth for this year to 4.6% and to next year to 4%. So below that 5% number that people have been talking about. Bloomberg MLI strategist Mark Cranfield, thank you so much. Well, on to the day ahead. It is a busy day, and it's not all about Nvidia. We've got some important inflation figures coming through from Europe today. So at 8 a.m. UK time, watch out for the Spanish inflation figures, expected to show somewhat of a moderation, so a tilt down on a year-on-year basis. You could say the same for those German inflation figures as well. Remember, with Germany, what you get is the state figures first, so the likes of Bavaria, Hesse, Brandenburg, all will come through throughout the course of the morning. And then later on at 1 p.m. UK time, you're going to get that harmonized number. It is expected to show a drop from 2.6% to 2.2%. All of this very important data as we head into the next ECB meeting. Later on at 1:30 UK time, we'll get U.S. initial jobless claims. These are weekly numbers, but the market has been watching them very closely given the focus on the U.S. labor market. And then later on, 8:30 p.m. UK time, Atlanta Fed's Bostic is speaking once again. He spoke not so long ago, one of the more hawkish members of the committee. And earlier on this week, he said that he would actually need to see more data to confirm the need to cut rates next month. So perhaps one of the members of the FOMC that the Chairman Powell will need to convince to go for that cut at the September meeting. So it'll be interesting to see what Bostic says when he does speak later today. And as ever, you can get a roundup of the stories you need to know to get your day going in today's edition of Daybreak. So terminal subscribers can go to DayBGo, that is DAYB Go, and you can take a look at some of the top stories on our terminal this morning. Of course, one of the mentions is Nvidia and a further analysis of the impact Nvidia earnings are having on global stock markets. Also coming up, in a first for the Biden administration, the senior White House official Jake Sullivan sat down for rare talks with a top Chinese general. We'll discuss that next. This is Bloomberg.
rare that we have the opportunity to have this kind of exchange. And given the state of the world and the need for us to responsibly manage the U.S.-China relationship, I think this is a very important meeting.
U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan on the importance of his rare meeting with the Chinese Army generals. So a senior White House official, Jake Sullivan, did sit down for rare talks with the top Chinese general. The meeting of Sullivan and Shan Yusha marks the highest level public exchange between a Biden administration official and the People's Liberation Army. Both nations are trying to prevent regional spats spiraling into a conflict. So let's get more on this story with Bloomberg's Jill Dices. Jill, it feels like quite a significant event, namely because it's very rare for U.S. officials to be meeting with Army representatives. So just talk us through the significance here of Jake Sullivan meeting with this top Chinese Army general.
Yes, Giovanna, I mean, that's right. It's certainly very significant here. In addition to this being the highest level public exchange between a member of the Biden administration and the PLA, the People's Liberation Army here, you also have this being the first time that a national security advisor from the U.S. has actually sat down with this level of PLA administrator official since, I believe, in the last 8 years. So, I mean, just the fact that you even have a Biden administration official, the national security advisor on the ground in China meeting with top military brass is really, that's really, really significant there. And this comes against, of course, Giovanna, this backdrop of a lot of serious concerns about military issues between these two countries. You first of all have a lot of concerns over Taiwan. China obviously has claimed these assertions of control over this democratically run island, which the U.S. has supported in various ways. So that was certainly a major agenda item here. You also have a lot of concerns over military incursions and actions within the South China Sea, how China has responded to things such as, the Philippines, somewhat of a U.S. ally there. So yes, I mean, lots certainly to discuss here, there's just a lot of uncertainty too going into the U.S. election later this year as to who exactly will be the leader after that. That you're probably looking at this attempt by the Biden administration to kind of future-proof ties with China, or at least stabilize relations heading into that election.
Yeah, it's so interesting because on one hand, economically, they've been sounding very hawkish, but at the same time, they do want to continue with these diplomatic channels, the conversations, keep them going, which is important when you're talking about, the biggest superpowers in the world. But how likely is it that we'll get a Xi-Biden talk or meeting in the aftermath of this visit?
Well, look, Giovanna, so right now, Jake Sullivan's been there for really the past 3 days, including very extensive meetings with Wang Yi, that's China's top diplomat. So he just came out of meetings with him yesterday, and the result of that was ultimately that they kind of laid the groundwork for a leader-to-leader talk. So that idea that there would be a Xi-Biden talk sometime in the future. We didn't really get a whole lot of concrete details around timing, how exactly that would work, whether that's a telephone call or what have you, but that was kind of the takeaway from that big meeting there. Now, whether that actually leads to an in-person meeting, I think that's still kind of to be determined there. They would have an opportunity potentially at the APEC summit later this year to meet on the sidelines there. Maybe that's paving the way for there. But I would just note, Giovanna, that, at this point in his presidency, President Biden has not actually traveled to China. As vice president in the Obama administration, he traveled to China in that role, but as president, he has not actually been to the country to see Xi Jinping. That would make him the first leader in quite some time to not actually do that. We'll see whether that changes before the end of his term in January.
Interesting. Well, there isn't a lot of time left for that to change, but it will be interesting. As you say, Bloomberg's Jill Dices, thank you so much for that report. Well, coming up, Chinese EV maker BYD falls in Hong Kong despite an impressive set of results in the first half of the year, according to Barclays. We'll take a closer look next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Bloomberg Daybreak Europe. Shares in BYD are lower in Hong Kong, despite the Chinese EV maker reporting a beat on first half net income. Our China cards reporter, Linda Liu, joins me now. So, Linda, BYD's stock price fell despite posting healthy gains in second quarter earnings. What's going on here?
I think the shares are down for BYD even after they managed to deliver quite healthy gains for their second quarter, as well as first half results, show that investor confidence in the wider EV market isn't so strong. This comes after US consultancy JD Power also lowered their sales forecast for EVs for the US market recently. So that just shows that the growth for EVs is slowing across the board. And for BYD, which is already dominating the China market and where competition is very intense, its growth prospects internationally is also going to face quite a lot of challenges.
Yeah, but it's not just specific to BYD. We've been talking about the many struggles that EV makers have been facing the last couple of months, be it because of tariffs or because of weak demand. What did the results today tell you about the outlook for the industry as a whole?
So, other than BYD, we've also had Li Auto and Xpeng, two other EV makers, report their earnings recently, and they didn't perform so well compared to BYD. Their earnings kind of disappointed estimates. So it just shows that other than BYD, smaller EV makers are facing a really tough time in the really fierce competitive market in China. Now, these EV makers are trying to look for growth drivers internationally, but like you said, they're facing increasing trade actions from the EU, as well as the US, where tariffs are going to be increased. And that's going to mean that they're going to be required to localize production in these regions. So in the short term, it's going to be a lot of challenges they need to overcome if they want to sell to those markets.
Yeah, it certainly does appear to be the case. I mean, over 1 year, just we had the list up now, some of those key Chinese EV makers, down more than 50-60%, really encapsulates the struggles that they're facing right now. Bloomberg China Cars reporter Linda Liu, thank you so much. Now to some of the other stories making news this morning. Shares of Qantas are lower after reporting profit that fell for the full year. The airline invested more to repair its battered reputation while airfares declined. The CEO, Vanessa Hudson, says there's more work to do before the company's brand recovers. And Air New Zealand's annual profit also tumbling more than half as a weak economy reduced domestic demand. The company said it expects tough trading conditions to continue throughout the first half of 2025 and declined to provide guidance on the earnings outlook. And Pavel Durov, the chief executive officer of Telegram, was charged in France for complicity in the spread of sexual images of children and other crimes such as drug trafficking on the messaging app. The billionaire is being ordered to post 5 million euros in bail and is banned from leaving France. Telegram didn't immediately respond to a request for comment on the charges. And Bloomberg has learned that OpenAI is getting closer to raising funding at a valuation of more than $100 billion. Thrive Capital is understood to be leading the round by investing about $1 billion. The financing would create one of the most valuable venture-backed startups in the world. And in just a short while, we're going to be discussing some of the geopolitical developments within the Middle East, with Israel saying it targeted militant groups in the West Bank, which Palestinian officials say killed 10 people. We'll discuss the latest escalation of tensions in the West Bank coming up next. This is Bloomberg. Good morning. This is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe. I'm Jemana Bersachi in Dubai, and these are the stories that set your agenda. Falling short, AI giant Nvidia tumbles as its revenue forecast misses some of the most optimistic estimates.
We're going to have lots and lots of supply, and we will be able to ramp starting in Q4. We have billions of dollars of revenues, and we'll ramp from there into Q1, into Q2, and through next year. We're going to have a great next year as well.
Breaking barriers, Jake Sullivan sits down for rare talks with a top Chinese general as both nations aim to improve military dialogue. And the latest read on inflation, Spain and Germany's CPI data out later this morning will let you know what to expect. But for now, let's get a check on how some of these markets are faring. The handover from Asian session has been quite negative, risk-off tone prevailing as we head into the European session. You can see that European futures are called about 0.2% weaker. The exception, the bright spot on the board, is the FTSE 100 seen opening slightly higher to the tune of 0.2%. But the handover from Wall Street was negative as well. Nasdaq, even before Nvidia earnings came out, closed down 1%. Post Nvidia, the stock dropped almost as much as 8% in after hours. And so you can see there's a sort of a hangover effect on these futures as we get closer to the start of the U.S. trade. I should say, however, that at one point these futures were a lot lower. So we're slowly coming back as the hours tick along. But talking about other cross asset, you can see not a lot of movement on 10-year U.S. Treasuries. We're trading sideways today. Yesterday we were about 1 basis point higher on the session. We're in wait and see mode. A lot of key data is coming up in the U.S. the next couple of days. Jobless claims today, the PCE number tomorrow, and then, of course, NFP in a week's time. So all of those are going to be very important data scrutinized by the Fed and the investment community as we head into that next meeting. Brent is about 0.25% higher, but again, as you can see, struggling to stay above $80 despite some of the geopolitical risks and the supply disruptions we've been talking about coming from Libya. And the euro trading at around 1.11 sideways as we head into those Spanish and German CPI figures coming up later today. Now, on to the Middle East. Israel has launched deadly raids in the West Bank to combat what the army says is terrorist activity. Palestinian officials say 10 people have been killed. Now, joining me now is Bloomberg's Middle East breaking news editor, Dana Khresh. Dana, just run us through what is happening in the West Bank. And to be clear, it's the West Bank, not Gaza, where the latest flare-up in violence is taking place.
Right. So Israel did say and did launch a very large-scale operation in occupied West Bank. Some say this is one of the largest in years, saying that they are targeting militants there and that they have taken out a few. We saw a statement now just came out this morning saying the names of the militants that they have targeted. Palestinians say that at least 10 people were killed, and the UN is saying that among them are actually children. And of course, these raids have been more frequent and more intense since the October 7 attacks. Now, we also saw some Palestinians saying that Israel blocked access to hospitals and also damaged civilian infrastructure. And we saw Hamas actually confirming the killing of some of its fighters in the West Bank and vowing to continue confronting Israel there. And this is also on the backdrop of the war in Gaza and increased settler violence there.
Well, I was going to say, how is the recent flaring up of tensions in West Bank likely to affect what is happening in Gaza as well?
I mean, it is not good, right? This is all part of the violence in Gaza, the West Bank, and will impact Israel. And as we saw a few weeks ago, there was also some attacks inside Israel coming from the West Bank. So this is becoming more of a flashpoint for Israel and more of a concern. Israel is accusing Iran that it is using the West Bank to destabilize the Jewish state, to smuggle weapons via Jordan. Of course, these claims can't be corroborated or verified, but this is Israel's long-standing claim against Iran and what's happening in the West Bank.
It feels as though the northern border has quietened down somewhat. We had that huge escalation with Hezbollah over the weekend. Walked in Monday. People were very nervous about what this could mean. But it feels as though the last couple of days things have calmed down somewhat. You've written a story on the terminal this morning that I think is interesting about how the Lebanese population are sort of dealing with this threat or potential threat of war.
Right. So the Lebanese have been living in the shadow of war since October, right? Since Hezbollah decided to involve and engage in the war in Gaza by firing rockets at Israel. And that has resulted in massive retaliation from Israel, right? With airstrikes killing, damaging Hezbollah infrastructure and actually damaging southern Lebanon. And Hezbollah's attacks have also killed dozens of people there in Israel as well. The Lebanese say this is their new normal, right? That they are resilient and that they live in the constant threat of war. But from my conversations with a lot of Lebanese there, it seems the war is a concern, yet that sanguine attitude towards the war only shows you how many other worries they have. They have an economy still reeling under the 2019 deep financial crisis there, the port explosion in 2020, the currency collapse, debilitating infrastructure. They have so much more to worry about, and yet they still live on and say, okay, so Israel's threat of war, this is our new normal. And that is sad, right? And some of them say, you know, they call us resilient, but a lot say that resilience has actually worked against them.
And just from an economic perspective, many were banking on a strong summer for tourism, but of course that didn't get to transpire because of the situational politics. Dana, thank you so much for joining us on our show today. That was Bloomberg's Middle East breaking news editor, Dana Khresh. Thank you. Well, as we've been reporting, Nvidia's earnings failed to meet Wall Street's lofty expectations. Here's how some guests have reacted.
I'm not concerned. I think if you look at Nvidia, they still control this market and will continue to, I would say, dominate this space over the next 3 to 5 years.
Delivering chips at this rate, at this scale, is fantastic and unprecedented. I don't think there's much of a revenue issue here, of a growth issue here. I think the little bit of a pushback is probably more around the margin situation.
That type of growth isn't necessarily realistic or sustainable in the long term. Two, it's not necessary in the long term either.
At the end of the day, we still sense enormous and urgent demand across the board. And that really mitigates, in our view, the risk of a pause in shipments as customers wait for the next generation of chips to be available in volumes.
Those are some guests on Bloomberg reacting to Nvidia results. Now, Nvidia Chief Executive Jensen Huang tried to reassure investors, saying production and supply will increase next quarter. Jensen Huang spoke exclusively to Bloomberg's Ed Ludlow.
We made a mass change to improve the yield. Functionality of Blackwell is wonderful. We're sampling Blackwell all over the world today. We show people, giving tours to people of the Blackwell systems that we have up and running. You could find pictures of Blackwell systems all over the web. We have started volume production. Volume production will ship in Q4. Q4, we will have billions of dollars of Blackwell revenues, and we will ramp from there. We will ramp from there. The demand for Blackwell far exceeds its supply, of course, in the beginning, because the demand is so great. But we're going to have lots and lots of supply, and we will be able to ramp starting in Q4. We have billions of dollars of revenues, and we'll ramp from there into Q1, into Q2, and through next year. We're going to have a great next year as well.
Jensen, what is the demand for accelerated computing beyond the hyperscalers and Meta?
Hyperscalers represent about 45% of our total data center business. We're relatively diversified today. We have hyperscalers, we have internet service providers, we have sovereign AIs, we have industries, enterprises. So it's fairly diversified. Outside of hyperscalers is the other 55%. Now, the application use across all of that data center starts with accelerated computing. Accelerated computing does everything, of course, from the models, the things that we know about, which is generative AI, and that gets most of the attention. But at the core, we also do database processing, pre and post processing of data before you use it for generative AI, transcoding, scientific simulations, computer graphics, of course, image processing, of course. And so there's tons of applications that people use our accelerated computing for, and one of them is generative AI. It's not necessarily, sometimes it deals with a particular regional service provider that's been funded by the government, and oftentimes that's the case. In the case of Japan, for example, the Japanese government came out and offered subsidies of a couple $1 billion, I think, for several different internet companies and telcos to be able to fund their AI infrastructure. India has a sovereign AI initiative going, and they're building their AI infrastructure. Canada, the UK, France, Italy, I'm missing somebody. Singapore, Malaysia, a large number of countries are subsidizing their regional data centers so that they could become able to build out their AI infrastructure. They recognize that their country's knowledge, their country's data, digital data, is also their natural resource. Not just the land they're sitting on, not just the air above them, but they realize now that their digital knowledge is part of their natural and national resource. And they ought to harvest that and process that and transform it into their national digital intelligence. And so this is what we call sovereign AI. You could imagine almost every single country in the world will eventually recognize this and build out their AI infrastructure.
Jensen, you use the word resource, and that makes me think about the energy requirements here. I think on the call you talked about how the next generation models will have many orders of magnitude greater compute needs. But how will the energy needs increase, and what is the advantage you feel Nvidia has in that sense?
Well, the most important thing that we do is increase the performance and efficiency of our next generation. So Blackwell is many times more performant than Hopper at the same level of power used. And so that's energy efficiency. More performance with the same amount of power, or same performance at a lower power. And that's number one. And the second is using liquid cooling. We support air cooling, we support liquid cooling, but liquid cooling is a lot more energy efficient. And so the combination of all of that, you're going to get a pretty large step up.
Well, the man of the hour himself, Nvidia CEO Jensen Huang, speaking exclusively with Bloomberg's Ed Ludlow. Now to some of the other stories making news this morning. Berkshire Hathaway has become the first U.S. firm outside the tech sector to top $1 trillion in market value. Warren Buffett's conglomerate has rallied this year on strong insurance results, outperforming the S&P 500 with a 30% gain. Berkshire joins an exclusive club dominated by tech giants, including Alphabet, Meta Platforms, and Nvidia. Now, shares of Salesforce jumped in extended trading after the company reported a strong profit outlook. The maker of customer management software sees profit exceeding $10 per share for the fiscal year, topping estimates. Salesforce also announced that the CFO, Amy Weaver, will step down from her position once a successor is chosen. And HP slipped in extended trading after cutting its full-year profit outlook on a continued downturn in its printer unit. Printer supply revenue is seen as HP's leading profit driver. The disappointing forecast eclipsed a first revenue gain in 2 years, suggesting an end to a long slump in demand for personal computers. And the EU ministers' informal meeting in Brussels is taking place later today, so you want to watch out for that. And as we were talking about, we've got key inflation data also on the agenda to watch out for. That German August CPI, this is the aggregate number for the country, coming out at 1 p.m. UK. 1:30 p.m. we will have those jobless claims numbers in the U.S., in addition to personal consumption data and U.S. GDP. And then much later on, this is at 2 a.m. UK, if you're still up at that time, Kamala Harris and Tim Walz will do their first joint television interview that is taking place on CNN. And then we've got a bunch of central bank speakers to watch out for throughout the day as well. ECB's chief economist, Philip Lane, Joachim Nagel, the Bundesbank president, and Atlanta Fed President Raphael Bostic will be speaking as well. He's one of the more hawkish members of the committee, so it'll be interesting to see what he has to say. But also coming up on Daybreak, Germany and Spain kick off a key round of inflation data, with ECB officials mulling a September rate cut. More on that next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Bloomberg Daybreak Europe. Germany and Spain are due to release August CPI data ahead of key Europe area inflation numbers tomorrow. Let's get more from Anna Andrade from Bloomberg Economics. So two big countries are reporting their inflation figures for August. What are we watching out for in the data, knowing that, of course, there is an expectation that this disinflationary trend is going to continue?
Hi, good morning. So I would say that the story in both Germany and Spain is broadly the same on inflation. In both economies, we're expecting a material fall in headline inflation, and that will be driven by energy contributions. So what happened is that at the same time last year, you had fuel prices climbing, and this time around, you're going to weekly data from the European Commission shows that they will fall on the month. And that will sort of push the headline inflation down, and close to sort of 2% in Germany. But actually, when you look at the core readings, they won't be available with this release. But if you look at the core inflation, there won't be as good news there. And there we were actually expecting for Spain and inflation and Germany, little to no change in the core reading. And that will be the story for the euro area figure that we're going to get tomorrow. It will get close to the 2% target, which is, for the European Central Bank that's trying to ease policy, it's at the very least good optics.
Yeah, so what you're saying is it's not all about the headline. We need to be looking at core as well, which will provide perhaps some ammunition to the hawks in the ECB committee. But what about, say, services inflation? And there could be some upside surprises coming through there because of transport, travel-related costs. How closely do you think the ECB will be watching out for that part of these inflation figures?
I mean, that's the metric that the ECB is kind of following more closely because it's it's a better gauge of the risks of inflation persistence. And there we expect the services inflation to be quite sticky, so to stay at 4%. Now, I think sticky services inflation is sort of a reason for the European Central Bank to proceed with cautious, but on its own, it's not enough to stand in the way of a September rate cut. And we actually expected the ECB that it will cut rates by 25 basis points again in September. And that's because essentially the Governing Council will have other things to consider. I mean, number one, it will look at the broader trend of the disinflation so far. And number two, there will be also wage data to consider. We've had negotiated wages for the second quarter for the euro area, and that has shown a fall to below 4% for the first time in a while. And then there's also growth concerns lingering. I mean, the euro area grew by 0.3% on the second quarter, but Germany is back to crisis modes. And the PMI, if you overlook the boost, temporary boost from the Olympics to French activity, the PMI for August also signals some sort of ongoing signs of weak momentum. And then, of course, the ECB will also look at the global context because we've had a very dovish Powell at Jackson Hole. Our U.S. colleagues expect the Fed to cut by 100 basis points. So bringing all together, we actually think that there's enough to justify another rate cut in September.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was just looking at what was priced in. You've got about 100 basis points of cuts priced in by the Fed from now to the end of the year, and the ECB are sitting at around 65 basis points. So that probably explains some of the positive move we've had in the euro over the last few weeks. Anna, thank you so much for that overview of what to watch out for. Anna Andrade from Bloomberg Economics. Well, in the UK, a left-leaning think tank is urging the Labour government to stick to its plans for higher taxes on wealth. That's even as business groups and advisors to the rich call for restraint. The Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, has laid the groundwork for the hikes, saying the upcoming budget will be more painful. UK banking stocks fell on the back of the news. Well, plenty more coming up in just a few moments. We'll be right back. This is Bloomberg.
I don't want us to be in a situation where we cut and then we have to raise rates again. Like, that would be a very bad outcome. It would really undermine all the confidence I was talking about people have.
That was Atlanta Fed President Raphael Bostic remaining cautious about the timeline for cutting interest rates in the U.S. And by the way, he will be speaking again later today. If you want to get more commentary from one of the more hawkish members of the FOMC, will be interesting to see whether the data changes his mind in the next couple of days. We've got key data coming out in the U.S., jobless claims today, tomorrow PCE, and then, of course, next Friday, we've got that NFP number to watch out for. All right, a couple of charts I want to draw your attention to. We've been talking about Nvidia for pretty much all of this show. So let's just show you the explosive revenue growth. So this actually still is a mega number that came through from Nvidia yesterday, reporting second quarter net income second quarter revenue of $30 billion, up 122% from a year ago. So we're talking about a doubling of revenue versus where it was exactly 12 months ago. And this is what I want to show you, this has been the smallest revenue beat in the last 6 quarters. And yet, despite that, analysts are keeping that $145 price target. So that is very interesting because the reaction in the markets yesterday seemed to suggest that the numbers were disappointing. Expectations had been set so high when it came to the revenue number. The guidance number perhaps didn't come in as high as some of those expectations. Broadly speaking, though, the analyst community is still quite positive on Nvidia, with the average target price of $145 versus a closing price of around $125. We have dipped down about 8% in the overnight session. But all in all, the market, not just the analyst community, continue to remain bullish on the prospects for Nvidia. And today, what we are seeing is a slight pullback for U.S. futures on back of the Nvidia results. But it's getting less and less as we head towards the start of the European session. At one point, NASDAQ futures were down more than 1.5%. Now we're only down about 0.6%. So that is Nvidia and its impact on the market. One other stock as well that caught some attention yesterday, Berkshire Hathaway. And here you can see that it has actually topped the $1 trillion market cap valuation. So we're finally there for Berkshire Hathaway, and it joins the other tech names in that prestigious basket. You've got Alphabet, Meta, and of course, Nvidia. All of them have a market cap of more than $1 trillion. Yesterday, I was just tweeting, but I thought it was interesting to know that Berkshire Hathaway now has a 1/3 valuation the size of Nvidia, which is interesting given how long each one of those companies has been around for. So there you have it. Just as something to leave you with and to something to think about. As we head into our next show, the opening trade is coming up next. Thanks for watching Daybreak Europe. This is Bloomberg.